After experiencing sexual abuse as a child, Jessica got recruited into the sex trade as a minor. She was shipped up and down the I-5 corridor into Hawaii and into Canada, overseas, working up to 12-hour days to earn her quota, the $1,000 per day that her pimp required. She escaped that world, sort of. Turns out it was not easy to find a job with a record of prostitution. She could work hard. She started extreme couponing. She started a business. She helped develop a curriculum to help other people save on their groceries. But it was still hard to find another job. In some respects, Jessica is a success story. Most aren't, and most will never hear about. Her Johns and pimps were criminals. Her criminal record failed to acknowledge that she was a victim and prevented her from moving forward and contributing in her life. Human trafficking is a global problem that impacts us here at home. It's hard to think about the sex trade affecting us here in Oregon, but once the surface is scratched, it's harder not to think about it. When I was first approached in 2010 to help with human trafficking legislation, I wasn't alone, I think, in this body in being uninformed. Since then, as a body, we've learned more and made some progress. It is not nearly enough. And with this bill, it will still not be nearly enough. The information we have, that we think we have, bears repeating. The average age of entry in an international human slavery-based prostitution is reportedly 12. And while precision is impossible, the international human trafficking industry is estimated to be a $40 billion a year industry. This is a global challenge. But the challenge isn't limited to faraway places. It isn't only in Vietnam or Thailand. And while it's notoriously hard to track, reports show the I-5 corridor is a trafficking pipeline, and that gangs are increasingly involved in forcing young girls into prostitution. With elevated penalties for drug trafficking, child prostitution can offer a more lucrative ratio of risk and reward. Where I live, unemployment and high school dropout rates are way too high. We have communities that are way too isolated. Housing policy keeps mixed-use and low-income housing out of certain areas, forces them into others. And the high concentrations of at-risk young people, especially young women, offer easier targets. As a result, traffickers force these vulnerable members of our community into dangerous cycles of criminal activity. This is an area for government. The unfettered market doesn't appreciate the difference between a 16-year-old girl and an Audi. Thanks to yeoman's work put in by a coalition of victims advocates, nonprofits, law enforcement, the Judiciary Committee, the faith-based community, elected leaders, our area is becoming a model for the nation in fighting child trafficking, but it is not nearly enough. House Bill 4146 is another small step that works on builds on the work done by the coalition that worked on the human trafficking hotline bill and other modest steps. In Oregon, we recognize that juveniles can't consent to sexual conduct. And local jurisdictions have almost all stopped charging children with prostitution. But this is a recent change. And there are some young adults whose reentry into society is made more difficult by a prostitution charge while they were a child sex trafficking victim. This bill will allow a judge to expunge a prostitution adjudication once the victim has reached age 18. The expungement will only cover the prostitution adjudication and not other crimes that may have occurred while the victim was being trafficked. We know that victims often face significant challenges recovering from trafficking. I urge you to support House Bill 4146 to help them reenter in society. This is a smaller bill about a bigger thing, an important thing to talk about. Like domestic violence decades ago, and sometimes now, this challenge remains that much of the challenge that people are unaware and don't talk about it. I appreciate your support for the smaller bill. I also appreciate our raised attention to the bigger thing.